They found her in the parking garage at 3 in the morning, sitting in her Mercedes with the engine off and the lights on, staring at a photograph. The valet who discovered her said she wasn't crying. She was smiling. It was the smile that scared him most. Because in that photograph was her husband, Richard Neal, laughing with his arms around another woman at a charity gala, while Teresa Andrews, 8 months pregnant with their first child, had been told by his assistant that he was in Singapore closing a deal. The photograph had been posted publicly by the woman herself, tagged with a location that wasn't Singapore. It was the Four Seasons, 15 minutes from their penthouse. That was 6 months ago. Tonight, Richard is throwing a $23 million party to celebrate the launch of his new venture capital fund, and Teresa was supposed to be there, playing the role of the devoted wife one last time. But Teresa isn't coming to the party. She's in a conference room 40 floors below the celebration, and what's about to happen in the next 47 minutes will prove that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who screams, it's the one who plans in silence. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The music is pounding in the penthouse suite of the Apex Tower in downtown Manhattan. Richard Neal, 46 years old, white, successful, and tonight, completely oblivious, is standing at the center of approximately 300 guests, giving a speech about vision and legacy. His girlfriend, Annie Feltz, 28, blonde, wearing a dress that costs more than a sedan, is standing next to him in a way that wives usually stand. The guests don't seem confused by this arrangement. They've seen the photos. They know Richard left his wife. What they don't know is that Teresa Andrews never actually left the building. While Richard is upstairs accepting congratulations, Teresa is downstairs in conference room 4B with 5 people. There's Lawrence Beaulieu, her attorney, known in legal circles as the surgeon because of how precisely he dismantles opposing cases. There's Kimberly Duong, a forensic accountant who once traced $2 billion through 17 countries for the FBI. There's Alfred Wyatt, a federal prosecutor who took a personal day to be here. And there's Robbie Hammer, Richard's own former chief financial officer, who 3 weeks ago walked into Lawrence's office with a box of documents and a crisis of conscience. The backstory begins 10 years earlier in Atlanta, where Teresa Andrews was finishing her MBA at Emory University with a focus in forensic accounting and corporate fraud detection. She wasn't from money. She came from a single mother who worked 2 jobs to put Teresa through school, and when she graduated top of her class, she had 17 job offers. She chose one at an investment firm in New York, and on her second week, she was assigned to audit a portfolio managed by a junior partner named Richard Neal. That audit dinner turned into a relationship, and 3 years later Richard proposed in the same conference room where they'd first met, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, telling her that everything he built, he wanted to build with her. They married in a small ceremony in the Hamptons. For the first 5 years, the marriage was exactly what Teresa had imagined. They worked hard, they traveled, they talked about starting a family. Teresa had left her job after the wedding because Richard insisted that having his wife audit his competitors created conflicts of interest, and she'd agreed because it made sense. But things never settled. Richard's firm grew from $400 million to $2 billion, then to $7 billion, and Teresa found herself in the role of the corporate wife, attending galas, hosting dinners, and slowly, quietly, disappearing into the background of Richard's life. The shift happened gradually. Richard began traveling more, coming home later, and when he was home, he was distracted, distant. There were small things that didn't add up. Credit card statements with charges from restaurants Teresa had never been to, hotel receipts from cities where Richard claimed to be staying with clients. When Teresa asked about these things, Richard had explanations that sounded reasonable, and Teresa wanted to believe him because the alternative meant accepting that her marriage was a performance. Then Teresa got pregnant. When she told Richard, he was in his home office reviewing quarterly reports. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. He said congratulations, he kissed her forehead, and then he went back to his laptop, and Teresa stood there in the doorway, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. That night, after Richard fell asleep, Teresa did something she'd never done before. She went into his office, she opened his laptop, and she guessed his password on the first try. It was her birthday, the one day he never remembered to celebrate, and as the screen illuminated her face in the darkness, Teresa saw the beginning of what would become the end of everything Richard had built. What Teresa found wasn't just evidence of an affair. Richard had been using Teresa's identity, her social security number, her credit, and her name to establish offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands. There were shell companies registered under variations of her name: Teresa M. Andrews LLC, Andrews Capital Holdings, TMA Enterprises, and each of these entities held assets that Richard had moved out of the United States to avoid taxation. But the most devastating discovery was a series of emails between Richard and his attorney discussing what they called the exit strategy, which detailed how Richard planned to divorce Teresa and, in the event of an investigation, position these offshore accounts as Teresa's illegal activity, effectively framing his pregnant wife for financial crimes that could result in federal prosecution. Teresa sat in that office until sunrise, methodically screenshotting every document, every email, every transaction record, uploading them to an encrypted cloud storage that Richard didn't know existed. She'd spent the entire night reading emails where Richard referred to her as the liability, where he joked with his attorney about how easy it would be to make Teresa look like the criminal since she was the one with the forensic accounting background, where he calculated exactly how much prison time she might face while he walked away clean. And Teresa realized that Richard hadn't just stopped loving her. He'd been planning to destroy her. But Teresa didn't confront him. She didn't scream or cry or demand explanations, because Teresa understood something that Richard had forgotten in his arrogance. She'd spent the first 5 years of her career catching people who thought they were smarter than the system, and she knew that the moment you reveal what you know, you lose your advantage. So Teresa played the role Richard expected. She was the tired pregnant wife, the woman too exhausted and hormonal to notice what was happening, and while Richard was busy underestimating her, Teresa was building a case that would take everything he'd spent 15 years creating. The first person Teresa contacted was Lawrence Beaulieu. She showed up unannounced at his home on a Sunday morning, and when Lawrence opened the door and saw a pregnant black woman holding a laptop, he almost said he didn't take clients on weekends, but something about Teresa's expression made him pause. For the next 6 hours, Teresa walked Lawrence through every document, every shell company, every offshore account, and when she finished, Lawrence sat back and said something Teresa would remember forever. He said, "Your husband didn't just commit fraud. He built you a throne out of his crimes, and if you want justice, I'll help you take it, but you need to understand that what we're about to do will destroy him completely." Teresa looked at Lawrence and said, "I'm not interested in destroying him. I'm interested in protecting my daughter from growing up thinking this is what power looks like." They spent the next 6 months preparing. Kimberly Duong came on board and traced the money through 14 different jurisdictions, identifying 23 shell companies. She calculated that Richard had moved approximately $860 million offshore, and she determined that not only were these accounts illegal, but Richard had also been using them to facilitate transactions for clients who were themselves under federal investigation for money laundering. Alfred Wyatt got involved because when Kimberly showed him what Teresa had found, he saw something bigger than a divorce case. He saw a pattern of corporate fraud that implicated not just Richard, but several of Richard's clients, and he told Teresa that if she was willing to cooperate with a federal investigation, the government would ensure that she was protected from any attempt Richard might make to implicate her. But they needed one more piece to make the case airtight, and that piece came from Robbie Hammer. Robbie had been Richard's CFO for 8 years, and he'd watched Richard's transformation from ambitious entrepreneur to something Robbie couldn't justify anymore. Robbie had 3 daughters of his own, and when he learned that Richard was planning to frame Teresa, something in Robbie broke. He started making copies of internal documents, communications between Richard and offshore account managers, records of transactions that Richard had specifically ordered Robbie to keep off the official books, and when Robbie had everything he needed, he walked into Lawrence's office and said he was ready to testify, even if it meant ending his own career, because he couldn't go home to his daughters knowing he'd stayed silent while a pregnant woman was being set up to take the fall for a crime she didn't commit. With Robbie's testimony and documents, Teresa's case went from strong to unbeatable. They had the paper trail, they had the insider testimony, They had evidence of intent, and they had Richard's own emails describing exactly how he planned to use Teresa as his scapegoat. But Teresa still didn't confront Richard. She waited. She played the role. She let Richard believe she was clueless, and she scheduled the final meeting for the exact night Richard planned to celebrate his new fun launch, because Teresa wanted Richard to feel what it was like to have everything taken from you at the moment you thought you'd won. Now, back to tonight, to this party where Richard is standing at the center of his universe, completely unaware that 40 floors below him, his entire world is being legally dismantled. At exactly 9:47, Lawrence sends a text message to Richard's attorney with a simple message: "We're ready, bring him down." Richard's attorney opens the attachment Lawrence sent and spends the next 4 minutes reading through what Teresa's team has compiled, and then he makes a phone call that will change Richard's life permanently. Up in the penthouse, Richard is mid-sentence when his attorney pushes through the crowd and pulls Richard into a side room. In that side room, Richard's attorney says words that make Richard's face go completely white. "The accounts are frozen, the feds are involved, and your wife isn't asking for a settlement. She's offering you a choice between resignation and prosecution." Richard tries to argue. He says Teresa doesn't have the resources or the knowledge to pull something like this off, and his attorney looks at Richard with something close to pity and says, "Your wife has a master's degree in forensic accounting, and she spent the last 6 months documenting every illegal transaction you've made since 2018, and if you don't sign what she's offering tonight, you'll be in federal custody by morning." Richard demands to see the evidence, and his attorney opens his laptop, and Richard reads his own emails, his own transaction records, his own strategy memos where he explicitly discussed framing Teresa. As Richard scrolls through page after page of documentation, he realizes that Teresa didn't miss anything. She'd found accounts he'd forgotten he'd opened, transactions he'd thought were buried too deep to trace. Richard asks how long Teresa has known, and his attorney tells him 6 months, which means Teresa knew before Richard started publicly appearing with Annie, before Richard told his friends the marriage was over, before Richard started planning this party, and Richard understands with absolute clarity that while he was busy celebrating his own cleverness, his wife was building a case that would end him. The walk from the penthouse to conference room 4B is the longest walk of Richard's life. When the elevator doors open, Richard sees Teresa for the first time in 2 weeks, and she looks different. She's wearing a black suit, her hair is pulled back, and she's standing next to people Richard recognizes. When Richard sees Robbie Hammer standing there, he understands that this isn't just a divorce negotiation. This is a complete dismantling of everything Richard thought was protected. Lawrence doesn't waste time. He slides a document across the table and explains the terms. Richard will resign immediately as CEO and majority shareholder of his firm. He'll transfer controlling interest to a trust established for his daughter. Teresa will assume management of that trust until their daughter turns 25. All offshore accounts will be repatriated and reported to federal authorities. Richard will pay a fine of $220 million to settle potential criminal charges. And Richard will agree to never hold a fiduciary position in any financial institution again. In exchange, Teresa won't press criminal charges, the federal government won't prosecute, and Richard will have the opportunity to be present in his daughter's life if he can prove through therapy and accountability that he's capable of being the father she deserves. Richard looks at Teresa and asks why she's doing this, why she didn't just divorce him quietly and take half, and Teresa's response is something Richard will think about for years. She says, "Because I didn't want half of something you built by stealing and lying. I wanted to make sure our daughter inherits a legacy that won't destroy her, and the only way to do that was to take everything you did and make it right, even if that means you have nothing left." Richard asks what happens if he refuses to sign, and Alfred Wyatt explains in detail the federal charges Richard would face, the mandatory minimum sentences, the asset seizures, and the fact that because Richard used his wife's identity to commit these crimes, the optics would be particularly damaging. Richard signs. He reads every page. He asks questions his attorney can't answer because the terms are negotiable, and then he signs his name in 9 different places. When the signing is finished, Teresa stands and Richard thinks she's going to say something harsh, but instead Teresa says, "I hope someday you understand that I didn't do this to hurt you. I did this to protect her, and our daughter deserves a father who knows the difference between power and cruelty, and if you can learn that difference, you'll be allowed to be part of her life." Richard leaves the building through a service entrance. Annie Feltz texts him asking where he is, and Richard doesn't respond because he doesn't know how to explain that the party was for a company he no longer owns celebrating a future that no longer exists. The guests upstairs continue celebrating for another 2 hours before someone realizes Richard isn't coming back, and by then the news has already started spreading through financial circles that Richard Neal resigned from his own firm under circumstances that are being described as complicated. For weeks later, Teresa gives birth to a daughter she names Andrea, and Richard isn't there for the birth because Teresa made it clear that his presence in their daughter's life isn't a right, it's something he is to earn. Richard starts therapy not because the legal settlement requires it, though it does, but because when he visited the hospital 3 days after Andrea was born and held his daughter for the first time, he looked into Andrea's face and realized that she would grow up knowing exactly what her father had done, and the only way Richard could ever face his own child was if he became someone different. The therapy is harder than Richard expected. His therapist makes Richard sit with the fact that he'd been willing to send his pregnant wife to prison to protect his own wealth, and Richard spends sessions crying in ways he hasn't cried since childhood. Richard learns that his behavior didn't start with the offshore accounts or the affair. It started years earlier when he'd made the decision that Teresa's contributions to his success were less valuable than his own ambition, when he'd stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as an accessory. 6 months after Andrea's birth, Richard gets permission from Teresa to see his daughter once a week for supervised visits at Teresa's mother's house. Richard brings gifts at first, expensive toys and designer clothes, and Teresa's mother pulls Richard aside and tells him that Andrea doesn't need things. She needs a father who shows up consistently and doesn't disappear when things get difficult. Richard starts coming empty-handed except for his presence, and slowly, week by week, he learns how to be a father to a daughter who will someday ask him hard questions and deserves honest answers. Teresa rebuilds her life in a way that surprises everyone except people who actually knew her. She moves to Connecticut with a yard and neighbors who don't care about finance or status. She starts her own forensic accounting firm specializing in helping people, mostly women, who suspect their spouses are hiding assets in divorce, and within a year her firm has a 6-month waiting list. She hires Kimberly Duong as her partner, and together they build a company that helps people who've been underestimated use their intelligence to protect themselves. Andrea grows up in a house filled with love and honesty. Teresa never speaks badly about Richard in front of their daughter, because Teresa understands that Andrea deserves the chance to form her own relationship with her father, without Teresa's anger shaping that relationship. When Andrea is old enough to ask why mommy and daddy don't live together, Teresa tells her age-appropriate truth, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt people they love, and when that happens, the adults have to take responsibility and try to become better, and Daddy is working on becoming better. The years pass, and Richard doesn't return to finance. He volunteers at a nonprofit that provides financial literacy education to low-income families, and at first he does it because his therapist suggested it, but eventually Richard does it because he discovers that teaching people how to protect themselves from predatory financial practices gives him something he'd never found in managing billions, which is the sense that his knowledge is being used to help people rather than exploit them. When Andrea turns 10, she asks Teresa the question Teresa has been preparing for since Andrea was born. She asks what Daddy did that was so bad that he had to give up his company, and Teresa sits Andrea down and explains that Daddy made choices about money that were against the rules, and he made those choices because he thought being successful was more important than being honest, and when Mommy found out, she had to decide whether to protect Daddy's secrets or protect their family's future, and she chose their future. Andrea asks if Daddy is a bad person, and Teresa says Daddy did bad things, but people who do bad things aren't always bad people. They're sometimes good people who lost their way, and the question is whether Daddy learned from those mistakes and became someone different, and that's something Andrea will have to decide for herself as she gets older. Andrea asks if she can talk to Daddy about it, and the next time Richard comes for his visit, Andrea asks him directly, "Daddy, did you do something bad with money?" And Richard doesn't lie. He sits across from his 10-year-old daughter and says, "Yes, I did something very bad. I made choices that hurt your mother and could have hurt our whole family." And I did it because I thought having money and power was more important than being a good person, and I was wrong, and I've spent every day since then trying to understand why I thought that way and how to make sure I never think that way again. Andrea asks if he's sorry, and Richard says I'm sorry in a way that's bigger than words, which is why I try to show you through my actions that I'm different now. They sit in silence for a moment, and then Andrea says, Mommy says you're trying really hard to be better, and I think trying really hard counts for something, and Richard realizes that Teresa, despite everything he'd done to her, had been protecting his relationship with their daughter by acknowledging his efforts rather than only focusing on his failures. Now, 16 years after that night in Conference Room 4B, Andrea is in her junior year at Columbia University studying social justice and public policy. She chose Columbia partly because it's where her mother got her MBA, and partly because Andrea wants to understand how systems of power work so she can spend her life dismantling the ones that hurt people. Andrea has access to the trust her father established. She's technically a billionaire, but she lives in a modest apartment with roommates and works part-time at a legal aid clinic. Richard and Teresa don't have a friendship. They probably never will, but they have something more important. They have a shared commitment to raising a daughter who understands that wealth without integrity is worthless and power without accountability is dangerous. When Andrea graduates from Columbia, both Richard and Teresa are in the audience, sitting 2 rows apart but standing together afterward when Andrea crosses the stage. And when Andrea comes down from the platform with her diploma, she hugs her mother first, holding on for a long time, and then she hugs her father, and Richard whispers, I'm proud of you. And Andrea says, I know, Daddy. Mommy told me you've been telling her that at every visit for 16 years. The story doesn't end with Richard redeemed, because redemption isn't a destination you arrive at. It's work you do continuously for the rest of your life. But it does end with Richard understanding something he'd spent 46 years not knowing, which is that the measure of a person isn't what they build or accumulate. It's what they do when their worst choices are exposed, and they have to decide whether to defend those choices or dismantle the person who made them and become someone different. Teresa's firm continues to grow, and she becomes known nationally as the person who helped change how courts handle cases of hidden assets in divorce. She testifies before Congress about the need for stronger international cooperation in tracing offshore accounts, and she creates a nonprofit that provides pro bono services to people who can't afford to hire private investigators. When Andrea asks her mother why she works so hard, Teresa tells her, I do this work because I spent years being underestimated by someone who thought my value was in how I looked standing next to him, and every case I win is proof that the woman someone dismissed as decorative was actually the one who saw everything they were trying to hide.
The lessons here are not simple, because real life rarely offers simple lessons, but there are truths in this story that matter. The first truth is that betrayal doesn't just happen in the moment of the affair or the hidden account. It happens in every small decision to value your own ambition over your partner's humanity. The second truth is that revenge and justice are not the same thing. Teresa didn't destroy Richard out of revenge. She held him accountable out of necessity, because the alternative was allowing her daughter to grow up in a world where her father faced no consequences for using her mother as a scapegoat. The third truth is that change is possible but not inevitable. Richard changed because he chose to do the work, not because time passed or because he felt bad. Now let me ask you something, because this story isn't just about Richard and Teresa and Andrea. It's about how we think about power and accountability. If you were in Teresa's position, if you discovered that your spouse had been planning to frame you for crimes they committed, would you have had the patience to build a case for 6 months while pretending everything was fine, or would you have confronted them immediately? If you were Richard's friend, watching him celebrate his new relationship while his pregnant wife was nowhere to be seen, would you have asked questions, or would you have assumed it was none of your business? And if you were Robbie, the CFO who knew what was happening, how long would it have taken you to decide that protecting your career wasn't worth being complicit in someone's destruction? There's a moment in this story that I think about often, and it's not the moment Teresa discovered the fraud or the moment Richard signed away his company. It's the moment years later when Andrea asked her father if he was sorry, and Richard told his 10-year-old daughter that he was sorry in a way bigger than words. which is why he tried to show her through his actions. Because that's the moment Richard stopped performing accountability and started living it. And the difference between those two things is everything. So what did you think about Teresa's decision to protect Richard's relationship with their daughter despite what he'd done? Do you think she was being generous, or do you think she was being strategic, knowing that Andrea would need a relationship with both parents? And what about Richard's transformation? Do you believe people like Richard can actually change in meaningful ways, or do you think his accountability was performative? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this one force us to examine our own beliefs about forgiveness and consequences. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the relationships in your own life or the ways power can corrupt people who start out with good intentions, then I want to tell you about our next story, which is about a woman who discovered that her late husband had a second family in another state, and her decision about what to do with that information will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty and truth. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story, because the work we do here matters. These aren't just entertainment. These are lessons about human nature and accountability. Until next time, keep watching and keep asking the hard questions.